Thank you to everyone for tuning in and following along with the Aurora German Renewables Week virtually. If you have any questions to us, please post these in the chat on the right. We will follow up after the event. To close off the first day on the new Green Deal and EEG policy pathways to net zero, I'm very pleased to welcome Peter Zapfel, who will give a perspective on the implementation of the European Green Deal and next steps, which will be followed by a Q&A to dive a bit deeper on some aspects of this exciting and very important topic. By way of introduction, Peter Zapfel heads the unit Effort Sharing and Governance in DG Climate Action, and I heard several people refer to him as the grandfather of the EU ETS. He holds academic degrees from the University of Business and Economics in Vienna and the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. After joining the Commission in 1998, he worked for the DG for Economic and Financial Affairs and DG Environment. He has represented the Commission as a delegation member in several UN climate negotiation sessions. And he has been involved in the Commission's work on emissions trading since 1998. In DG Environment, he has coordinated a DG internal task force for the Commission's assessment of national allocation plans for phase 2 of the EU emission trading system. Prior to his current assignment, he was head of the unit of the Economic Analysis and Strategy Unit in DG Climate Action. Peter, thanks for coming. The stage is yours.
Thanks, Manuel, and I'm very grateful that I have the chance to provide some input to your interesting event. So what I would like to do in the time dedicated for my presentation is basically take you through the short history of the Green Deal, but also look forward what comes next in terms of implementing the Green Deal, which is a very important, if not the leading theme of the incoming or the current college that has taken office a bit over a year ago. In essence, what I'd like to do is I'd like to cover four topics in my presentation. First, to look a bit back and review the main objectives of the European Green Deal in the climate area, the climate and energy area. Secondly, to see how far have we come in terms of implementing the Green Deal in the first year since the Commission started work on this in late 2019. In particular, looking at progress on the climate law and also the discussions having taken place on climate change in the European Council last December. I will then take a bit of an excursion and look at the implications of the COVID crisis and the importance of recovery programs for the Green Deal and for furthering our efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, while then finishing off with a very important outlook. What is the Commission working on now as we prepare for the so-called Fit for 55 package, which is a set of legislative proposals in preparation for being presented mid this year to take us to the 55% reduction target for the year 2030. To start with, on the first topic, of course, the Green Deal in its dimensions is much larger than merely climate policy. It touches on many policy areas in the environmental field, biodiversity, and a number of other things. So I will focus on the main elements relevant for climate policy. And to start with, to say at the heart, of course, of the European Green Deal is the political aspiration that Mrs. von der Leyen has formulated in mid-2019 in her political guidelines when she was campaigning for becoming president of the European Commission, for Europe to become the first climate-neutral continent by 2050. The climate law translates this political aspiration into a legislative commitment. The climate law was one of the first acts on implementing the European Green Deal. It was proposed in March 2020 and has by now, or at the end of last year, in fact, reached the final stage in the legislative process, the so-called, in Brussels speak, trilogue process, which is when the three main institutions, the EU Council of Ministers, the European Parliament, and the European Commission come together and work out the final wording of new legislation, of new European legislation. So we are very far in terms of translating this political commitment into a legislative commitment as the overarching frame for the European Green Deal. Let me also say at this stage, we are very, very heartened by the fact that what we have started off a bit over a year ago in Europe has already inspired some followers internationally, most notably with China working on its next 5-year program to also put in place a carbon neutrality commitment with the timeline 2060. But also some news we have seen out of South Korea and Japan in terms of them moving towards climate neutrality. So this is very good to see, given the global nature of the climate problem, that we inspire others by the work we do in Europe. Let me also say this European Green Deal and this commitment to climate neutrality does not only mean that the work of DG Climate Action is affected by this, but it is in fact a cross-cutting agenda for many other director channels in the Commission. And it touches on many other policy areas. To name just a few, it touches on the budget and finance with climate mainstreaming, that is linked to the recovery programs I will refer later on in my presentation. It affects transport policy, industry policy, agricultural policy, and it also quite an important effect on the so-called European semester process, a macroeconomic surveillance process that the Commission is conducting on an annual basis. A very important feature of the European Green Deal is also the element or the emphasis that is put in managing this transition to climate neutrality in a just and fair manner. For this reason, the incumbent, the new college, has put a heavy emphasis on ensuring a just transition. The move to climate neutrality is, like any other major policy change, something that will create winners and losers in society and business. The notion of just transition is to address those distributional concerns, and the relevant and pertinent distributional concerns in an appropriate manner in managing this transition. It is also important to note that addressing its distributional concerns is as such not a new thing in climate policy making. However, it gains in importance over time when the more difficult emission reductions need to be realized and the closer we move de facto towards climate neutrality. As the policy response, more or less around the same time as the climate law, very early on in the mandate of the Commission has come forward with the creation of a just transition mechanism that aims to mobilize 100 billion euros and in fact consists of 3 pillars. One of those pillars is a dedicated just transition fund that has been included in the multi-annual financial perspective that European leaders have agreed in the European Council in last December. Once you agree on and have a broad consensus to go for climate neutrality, the obvious thing that Mrs. von der Leyen has also raised from the very beginning is the need to have another look whether we're moving quickly enough to be on course for the 2050 climate neutrality. And that relates to the debate about the existing 2030 target and the existing climate policy architecture being put in place and legislated in a debate between 2015 and 2017 to realize, in fact, the existing 40% target by 2030. The Commission has concluded that not going beyond the 40% reduction by 2030 would leave too much effort for the 2 decades thereafter and would therefore not be in Europe's interest, being economically irrational and suboptimal not to increase the base. Secondly, we also are mindful that the policy architecture that we have devised for realizing a 40% target needs to be reviewed in view of making it fit for climate neutrality. So while we will not propose to legislate for 2050 in concrete policy instruments, when we review this architecture now, we also need to see what changes are needed in a 2030 perspective to be on the right course towards 2050. In mid-2019 and also in the Green Deal communication in end 2019, the College has said we would like to look at an increase of this 40% target to a value of between 50 and 55% by 2030. After a lot of analytical work, in September last year, the Commission has presented the climate target plan, which has concluded that going all the way to 55% is both feasible and beneficial for the European continent. And this is therefore the target that the Commission has recommended European leaders to endorse. The issue, as presented in September, has then quickly made it on the agenda of European leaders and has been discussed in the December European Council, where in fact leaders agreed to endorse a reduction target of 55% by 2030. Leaders have also emphasized a number of principles that the Commission should take a good account of in drawing up the necessary legislation to realize the higher target. This concerns aspects like making sure that we do this in the most cost-effective manner, paying sufficient attention to fairness and solidarity, and also the notion of just transition has been prominently mentioned as a guiding principle for drawing up this legislation. Leaders have also pointed to the importance of the multi-annual financial perspective, the EU budget for the years 2021 to 27, and to the next generation EU program, the recovery program, for leveraging and funding the necessary investments. Of course, being mindful that the bulk of the investments needed to realize our targets will be private investments, but also public sources and public funding has an important role to play in that regard. Leaders have furthermore decided to revert to this issue and give more guidance before the proposals are being finalized by mid this year by the Commission. Let me now take this excursion and look at the impact of the COVID crisis, which has affected basically every feature of our society, economy, and in fact our daily lives, which we also see in the way that this meeting is organized today. So you may have expected, as we've seen in the past, whenever the economy is going down, the political support for making headways in climate policy is coming down as much as the economy is going down, as we've seen in the past. In fact, what is very encouraging is that despite the deep crisis that we've seen and our economies have slid into due to COVID, the momentum on the European Green Deal has not slowed down, but if anything has been further amplified. In the short term, the economic hit, the severe economic hit, results in a strong drop of emissions, which we will better understand once the first complete 2020 emissions estimates are available later this year. At the same time, I think we are all mindful in the public debate that these reductions that the economic crisis has produced can be quite short-lived. Hence, there has been a strong emphasis being put by the Commission and other European actors that national and European recovery programs try to turn those short-term pains, as you can look at them, because you don't want to reduce emissions by deflating your economies, into more lasting gains and use this as a way of accelerating emission reduction efforts. National energy and climate plans, which were finalized in late 2019 and early 2020, contain lots of well thought through investments and reforms in the climate and energy area. And the recovery plans at national and European level basically offer the opportunity to speed up the implementation of these energy and climate plans. At the heart of the next generation EU facility that I mentioned before lies the Recovery and Resilience Facility, as in legal speak the European Recovery Program is called, which mobilizes substantial amounts of resources in the coming years. This Recovery and Resilience Facility, also agreed in the European Council in last December, makes available a total of more than 670 billion euros, of which over 310 billion euros alone will be made available as grant financing to member states, to the 27 member states. A wise use of those resources not only to restart our economies, but also to give a major impetus for climate-friendly investments and reforms is therefore warranted in Europe's interest. These concerns things like accelerating building renovation, giving funding for building charging infrastructure for electric cars, or also making headways in moving forward on producing power from hydrogen. At least 37% of the funds in each national recovery and resilience plans have by legal mandate to be spent on climate-related investments. The Commission has formulated 7 flagship initiatives to this end, three of them very relevant for the area of climate change. And member states are hard at work now in the coming months, in line with the legislation by the end of April, to draw up their recovery and resilience plans and notify them to the Commission for assessment. So with this excursion and the opportunity arising out of this, let me move back towards the key work item that is taken forward now in the Commission, and that will also then thereafter keep Council and Parliament and many interested stakeholders, including, I'm sure, Aurora, with providing good analysis on this, that will keep many actors busy on this continent. So as a follow-up of the European Council decision of last December, the Commission plans a comprehensive legislative package of drawing up or amending a dozen pieces of legislative instruments to deliver the 55% reduction target. This includes all major pieces of climate legislation, being on the one hand the emissions trading system, being the effort sharing regulation regulating emissions outside the ETS, being the land use and land use change and forestry regulation, as well also the instrument that defines efficiency standards for cars and vans. In addition, the main pieces of clean energy legislation that we have at European level will also be part of this Fit for 55 package. This concerns most notably the Renewable Energy Directive, as well as the Energy Efficiency Directive. Consultation processes to canvass views from the public, as well as impact assessment work is underway for all of those files. I would like to turn now to one of the main pieces of legislation that will need to be reviewed in order to achieve the high emission reduction targets, which usually draws most of the attention, both from stakeholders, but also in the legislative debate, which is the emissions trading system, and sketch out the main aspects that are addressed in the ongoing impact assessment work. There's in fact 5 issues that are the core of this review. On the one hand, realizing a higher target means we have to go for a data cap, a data linear reduction factor that regulates how many allowances year by year are put in circulation in the carbon market. At the same time, we'll have a first review of the parameters that govern the operation of the market stability reserve in the ETS, which is a very important mechanism that has allowed to address the oversupply coming from the recession about 10 years ago. We're going to look at extensions of emissions trading to maritime emissions and also potentially emissions from building and road transport, while taking into account the interactions with existing regulatory and non-regulatory framework and instruments applicable in those sectors. Let me focus in a bit on the ongoing work on the impact assessment for reviewing the emissions trading system, sometimes referred to as Europe's flagship policy to address climate change. The impact assessment work is underway, and there's 5 issues that are going to be in the focus of the impact assessment currently conducted. Firstly, realizing a more ambitious reduction target means data cap needs to be defined in the ETS, or the number of allowances year by year being put in circulation in the market needs to be reduced. Secondly, at this occasion, we will also undertake a first review of the parameters that govern the operation of the Market Stability Reserve, a tool that has been created and is in implementation since 2019 to address the oversupply in the ETS that stems from the last recession about 10 years ago. Thirdly, and probably the most important aspect, is the Commission looks into extending the use of emissions trading to further emissions, including maritime emissions, but also potentially emissions from buildings and road transport fuels, while taking into account interactions with existing regulatory and non-regulatory instruments applicable to those sectors. As a 4th item in the impact assessment, we look at distributional and innovation challenges related to the transition to climate neutrality, including the use of auction revenue from the ETS and the Modernization and Innovation Fund, 2 important funding vehicles established in the last revision of the ETS directive in late 2017, early 2018. And last but not least, we see whether there's a need for any change of carbon leakage provisions applicable since the start of this year, which are rules that define how many free allowances exposed energy-intensive industries get to avoid carbon leakage from implementing the ETS. And in parallel to this impact assessment, the Commission is also looking at the use of some of the auction revenue as a so-called own resource for the EU budget to repay the next generation EU program. There's another link of this process with the ongoing recovery efforts that we're working on that I reviewed before. I'd like to say a few things of the main challenges of this ongoing work in the Commission, the following the debate in the legislative bodies in revising the climate policy architecture. The architecture that we have been operating for quite a few years and developed in Europe to address climate change in European legislation is an architecture that has rested on 2 pillars, the ETS on the one hand and the effort sharing regulation on the other hand. And we had a clear delineation between those 2 instruments. Since the start of this year, from the original 2030 legislative package, we've extended this to a 3rd pillar with the land use regulation that is just about to be implemented. Now, the overall EU climate target is converted into a net emissions target. That means we say we would like to have net zero emissions in 2050. That means you can still have some emissions in your economy, but your emissions are balanced by carbon removals. And that necessitates requires the need over time to include carbon removals into our regulatory framework. It's also an ongoing work item, but with a time perspective extending beyond net this year for those proposals. At the same time, adapting the boundaries between the ETS and the ESR, the emissions trading system and the effort sharing regulation, would be a real game changer. So you may ask yourself, why not simply scale up reductions in the existing legislation? In my view, I think this is not the best option and the preferable option for Europe because of two reasons. On the one hand, we see that technological changes that are materializing and solutions that companies work on to address climate change necessitate that our regulations go across boundaries, and the split between the ETS and the ESR as we've been operating it. Some measures and some technologies developing, they constitute a real challenge, so that needs to be another look needs to be taken there. Secondly, I think merely from the kind of the degree of certainty to delivering what we want to achieve in terms of the reductions that we're aiming for. If you look back since 2005, since those two pillars of our architecture have been operating, in the sectors under the ETS, we have been more successful in cutting emissions than in the sectors and covered by non-ETS legislation, the effort sharing regulation sectors. So as we're going for sufficiently more ambitious targets, we simply need to ask ourselves the question, is what changes do we need to make to our policy mix to get there? I'd like to finalize my contribution by looking at the main challenges and the implications of such a potential extension of emissions trading to road transport and buildings emissions, which would be a real game changer, not only from a regulatory point of view, but also in terms of market effects. And I do really count on Aurora to accompany this process and also to provide some good analysis as we go through the decision making once the proposals are on the table. Our analysis is in progress in that regard, but let me share with you to round off some preliminary thoughts. One thing that needs to be looked at is we need to create a learning system like the existing ETS that allows us to build in, if we see early mistakes and we need to make changes, that we have an architecture that any such mistakes, not intentional but unintentional mistakes that may be made in the initial design of these additional sectors in an emissions trading system, that those mistakes are not propagated to the existing ETS. Another challenge that needs to be reflected about is to develop a vision how and when new sectors should be fully integrated into the existing emissions trading system. What is worthwhile to note in that regard, and what is sometimes overlooked in public debate, is that in fact electrification brings some of these new sectors already as some part of the emissions of those new sectors de facto already into the existing ETS. So, for example, every time you switch from a conventional car to an electric car, de facto a small part of the transport sector is already entering the emissions trading system. I think we also need to ensure a good integration of carbon prices in the existing policy mix. And I know that some stakeholders are concerned that the new instrument will immediately replace the old instrument. That is not the approach the Commission will be taking. We see some of those emissions are more difficult to reduce when we look back at our trends and records over the last 15 years. So we see a need to reinforce policy instruments and not to trade off the one policy measure for the other policy measure. And last but not least, a very important aspect in this will be how to address distributional issues that arise from the use of carbon pricing and transport and heating for the most vulnerable households across the European continent. So these are some of the challenges that are looked at now in view of preparing this Fit for 55 proposals. As I said, I count on Aurora, that you stay involved in this and that you also provide your intelligence and your analysis to what will be a very interesting and also very important debate in making next steps in turning the European Green Deal into reality and moving towards climate neutrality. So thanks very much for your attention, and I look forward to some further conversations with the group I have.
Thank you, Peter, for this great overview. Clearly very relevant. And I agree. I mean, there's lots of analysis that can be done, needs to be done. And I'm personally very excited about contributing to this discussion. If you allow, I'd like to dive a bit deeper on some aspects and also the challenges you mentioned. So let's perhaps start with the power sector. What do you think will be the impact of the EU Green Deal on this sector in particular? Will be the pressure on carbon prices? Will it be enough to achieve our renewable targets without subsidies?
Well, that's one of the very relevant questions. I think if you look back over the last 10 or 15 years, I look at the power sector that is the best prepared sector for the transition to climate neutrality. The power sector, more than any other economic sector in Europe, has early on embraced the merits of managing the cost-effective transition by means of a continent-wide price signal. I would think in terms of the question you ask, several factors as we go forward work in the direction of a reduced need over time for a subsidy element to achieve our renewables targets. That's on the one hand, including is it the increasing carbon price from more ambitious targets we are pursuing. But then I think we're also seeing more and more cost decrease on the side of renewables because of technological progress.
Great. Yeah, and one point we often discuss with our clients is not just the, say, expected or the absolute level of the carbon price, but also the volatility and the uncertainty around it. It matters a lot for investors, obviously, especially post 2030. Do you think an instrument like carbon CFDs for renewable investors could be a way to reduce this uncertainty and thereby lower the capital cost requirements? And how do you see the EU ETS evolving post 2030?
Well, I think with the introduction of the market stability reserve that I mentioned before, the carbon price has in fact become a lot more stable. As you say, my understanding is it's a bigger factor for investments is the level rather than the volatility of the price. The ambitious targets that we're pursuing in the EU, paired with the strong political will and the societal commitment to them, will support the carbon price as we go forward, reducing not only the need for a subsidy element, but also reducing the need for any complementary solutions to manage price uncertainty. I think the market stability reserve has a fundamental impact. I see some of the actors there haven't sufficiently looked at the implications of it yet, but as we now operate, basically we're entering the third year that the ETS is operating with the market stability reserve. People will realize that this reduces the need for some other arrangements.
Great, thanks, Peter. And if you allow, moving on to another sector, industry, which is clearly highly relevant, especially for the coming decades. What do you think will be the main instruments to deliver the higher emission reduction targets in industry? Is it through the EU ETS, you mentioned linear reduction factors, the market stability reserve, or through other policy measures on a national level, similar to what we've seen perhaps in the power sector in the past with the coal exit and renewable subsidies?
I think making headway to decarbonizing industry takes increasingly center stage. As I say, the power sector is ready and is full in this logic. On the industry side, I think literally in the last years, after the last reform of the ETS has been concluded, we have seen that engineers do not actually, in fact, lack the creativity to develop the big leap ideas that you need to decarbonize our major energy-intensive sectors. The ETS has a major role to play in this regard in terms of accelerating the market take-up of proven abatement technologies. That makes sense based on the prevailing carbon price. At the same time, in the last ETS reform, the carbon price as a pull factor has been complemented by the innovation fund as a push factor. Promising technologies that are not yet economic at a given carbon price will continue to need support to bring down costs further, as much as it will also need R&D policies, as part of the policy mix.
Yeah, great. Thanks. I mean, I think there are lots of topics where this is being put into practice, like the hydrogen strategies across the various member states, but also overall on the EU level. Where do you see the abatement potential in industry? So, or another way of phrasing it, what needs to be addressed over the coming decade?
Well, as I elaborated before, I believe deploying those measures will enable industrial decarbonization over the next decades towards 2050. In terms of your question of what to do when, I do not think this is a question that can be answered politically or with regulation. The answer, in fact, differs across sectors and even across individual companies, being dependent on the age structure of individual industrial facilities. Technological developments are not plannable as such, but they can be accelerated by a well-designed policy, and I believe they should also be accelerated and will be accelerated by such policies.
Great, thanks. And you also talked about a potential big step, so how to incentivize emission reduction in transport and heating and the potential expansion of the EU ETS to these sectors. Do you think it's realistic?
Well, I would say finding an effective policy response to let me start again. I was stumbling a bit. In fact, finding an effective policy response to this question is one of the key issues to realize our 55% reduction target by 2030. Evidence so far shows, as I said before in my presentation, that we have been reducing emissions much faster in the ETS sectors, power and industry combined, than we have been managing reduce emissions in the non-ETS sector, the main ones, transport and heating. So in view of this, the discussion on expanding emissions trading to those sectors is relevant and needed.
Yeah, and obviously there have been other approaches being taken. I mean, could the German approach, for example, with separate prices for these sectors be an alternative? And if so, should these be merged with the EU ETS later on?
I think what's happening in Germany is very interesting. I think what Germany does is useful for the wider European discussion and decision making. It does allow and will allow over time the European co-legislators to build in the early lessons emerging from what is implemented as of this month in last month in Germany in the design of European legislation. As the initial ETS has shown us, major new policies are not perfect from day one. Hence, we need to be mindful that some of this learning will also make us smarter if a decision is taken to include transport and buildings in an emissions trading system. Capitalizing on this learning, therefore, needs to be built into the initial design. There's various ways of doing this. For example, by having a separate category of allowances for transport and building in the beginning, a bit similar to what we do in aviation, which would have a similar effect of having a separate price formation for those sectors. As much as what Germany is doing is, I think, another alternative that will be further looked at and discussed as we go through this discussion and decision making.
Very interesting. Thanks for sharing this perspective. Also, with the higher carbon prices and power, but also the inclusion of further sectors on the horizon, the effect on household incomes will become more relevant, and you already referred to that in your overview. What role do you think will distributional effects play in the future, and how can they be addressed?
Ultimately, all policies end up being paid by the end consumer, whether we admit this or not. This is also the case for the carbon price, for example. It is already built into retail power price formation. And I do remember vividly in the early years of the ETS how people were at some stage agitatingly discussing this effect, which some people called an unintentional effect, but this is how economies work and how economic effects are propagated through a system. At the same time, when it comes to transport and buildings, the link between the policies being decided on the one hand and the end user prices that consumers see on the other hand are much more visible and direct. Hence, this increasing focus of ensuring a just transition. Therefore, building features into the policy design that allow addressing some of these undesirable distributional impacts, while at the same time not undermining the efficiency of the instruments in the first place, is a very important thing that we need to reflect very carefully about and develop solutions how to do this. What is, in my view, important in that regard is that distributional flanking policies should not be of a purely compensatory nature. Mm-hmm. So to say that the resources are used wisely to tackle the issue at the root. What I mean with this, by means of an example, I think in my view, it would not be wise to simply give households subsidies that offset the higher heating costs they would be exposed to as a result of having those emissions in an ETS. But you should rather invest money in a way that reduces the exposure of those households to the carbon price in the first place. And this, to finance new ways of how they heat their houses. And this is also, again, to close the loop again, where the recovery plans are of a very important nature that member states possess of resources to accelerate some of those things, to get heat pumps and some of those solutions being installed and make the vulnerable the vulnerable households less vulnerable by the time we may take those policy decisions.
Great, thanks. And the last question, I promise. Another topic you already touched upon is using auction revenues from emission trading as own resources for the EU budget. Is there, in your view, a risk that future reforms of the EU ETS get discredited as a way to improve the EU's funding?
Well, in the last 7 years, in the next 7 years in this EU budget 2021 to 27, a substantial amount of resources on the spending side of the EU budget and also in this next generation EU program will be mobilized to advance climate policy. Looking backwards, in recent years, the EU's carbon market has given rise to growing public revenue from auctioning carbon allowances. Annual auction revenue has grown from about 3.5 billion euro in 2013 to actually more than 19 billion euro in 2020, the last year for which we have auction revenue data. In the last 3 years combined, member states have earned close to 50 billion euro from auctions. So you see, we talk about considerable amounts of money there. An increasing reliance on carbon pricing, is what we just been discussing about, to realize our ambitious 2030 and 2050 climate targets, is likely to further boost total auction revenue in the years to come. So these developments, in my view, make it legitimate to seriously consider the role of auction revenue, not also on the revenue side of the EU budget, not only on the spending side. In terms of the question, I think, from my view, I do not see a risk in discrediting reforms by channeling part of the revenue into the EU budget. Why should the EU have a different interest than member states currently have as recipients of the auction revenue? What we need and what we need to work on is to have a strong ETS as a cost-effective driver of the transformation of our economies in the coming decades. Auction revenue, in this wider sense of things, is a byproduct of a strong carbon market. Nothing more, nothing less.
Great, thanks. Now is probably a good time to come to a close. Peter, thanks again for sharing your perspective. As I said before, I can only repeat it. It's very interesting and clearly highly relevant. Very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, and also look forward to your continued high quality input into the discussion process. I think your work is really useful, and we also studied very carefully in Brussels.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, very much looking forward to working on that in the future as well.
Thank you.